Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we got a major, big topic. We are talking about kind of you could call it the big three of Cold War conflicts that occurred during the 20th century. 20th century, yeah, 20th century. So it's gonna be a long one. There are a lot of pictures, but it is a lot of writing because in previous textbooks that I've used, they've been given their own section: the Korean War, the war in Vietnam, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But now they're all combined in one. So forewarning. All right. So let's get into it. All right. Cold War conflicts, chapter 13, lesson 3. So this is the last lesson of chapter 13, but we are, you could say, halfway after this lecture. We are halfway through the chapter, or unit 8. We're in unit 8, remember. That was your warm up. Okay, we're going to identify causes of the Korean War. We're going to sequence events surrounding the war in Vietnam. And we're going to draw conclusions about how the domino theory influenced US policy during the Cold War. All right. What's your superpower? So, in World War II destroyed European supremacy in world affairs. As the Cold War conflict between the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and us, the United States, grew stronger. European nations were divided into two armed camps, dependent upon one or the other of these two major powers. The division also spread to the rest of the world. The United States and Soviet Union, whose rivalry brought much of the world to the brink of nuclear war, seemed to hold the survival of the world in their hands. They got the whole world in their hands. Neither power went to war directly with each other, but instead they fought a series of proxy wars. Again, that is why it's kind of called the Cold War. Not they gave them the cold shoulder, but they never directly fought. Proxy wars occur when two powers in conflict use substitutes instead of fighting each other directly. It's like, tag, you're it. Armed with nuclear arsenals, neither the US nor the Soviet Union wanted to fight each other directly. Both were willing to support opposing sides in local wars in the struggle between their world views. Remember, communism, capitalism don't mix. So they're all chess pieces in the game of Cold War chess. They are the pawns. All right, influence. So the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, as we learned in previous lectures, directed post-war policy of the United States, supplying economic and military aid to stop the spread of communism. Alliance building also played a role. In addition to NATO and Europe, the U.S. also built alliances in other parts of the world. To stem communist aggression in the East, the U.S., Great Britain, France, Pakistan, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand formed the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, similar to NATO, but this one's called CEATO. And likewise, they formed the Central Treaty Organization, which included Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Great Britain, and the U.S., which was meant to prevent Soviet expansion in the Middle East. The Soviet Union will also create a series of alliances as well in addition to the Warsaw Pact, but your book doesn't say or mention any of those. Two major conflicts of the Cold War were the wars that broke out in Korea and Vietnam. The Soviet Union and the United States each sent military support to prevent the other side from expanding its influence, because it's all about influence these days. A Cold War conflict almost turned to a major nuclear war over the small island of Cuba. The US and Soviet Union also competed for political influence, again, hashtag influencer, in Africa, particularly in the Congo, and likewise in Chile, in South America. So this is CETO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and this is CENTO. So here's the Soviet Union's right here, right? So prevent expansion more south. Prevent expansion more south, except for China. Lost cause. Those are influencers, right? TikTok influencers. And the arm wrestling match between the Soviet Union and the United States. Um, hold up. Why is this picture here? All right, hold on. I must fix something. Where do I want to put it? Yeah. Hello. Thank you. All right. Sorry. It looks like a lot. It is a lot. And I believe it is not even half of it. So here you got the Forgotten Wards. Obviously, in reference to, obviously, you don't know that. It's in reference to the Korean War that breaks out shortly after World War II ends. So, story time. Japan controlled Korea until 1945. In August 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to divide Korea into two zones at the 38th parallel. The North, given to the Soviet Union, they would have communist style government. The South, given to obviously the United States. And the plan was to hold elections after World War II to reunify Korea. But as American Soviet relations grew worse, two separate governments emerged in Korea. Like I said, communists in the North, anti communists in the South. 1948, Harry S. Truman won re election as President of the United States. And due to that, tension between the governments increased. With the apparent approval of Joseph Stalin, communist North Korean troops invaded South Korea June 25th, 1950. Now, President Truman, seeing this as yet another example of communist aggression and expansion, gained the approval of the United Nations and sent U.S. troops to repel the invaders. It was also a majority of other other United Nations who shared troops, volunteers to fight, but they were, I think, like, what was it, like 59%, 49% were a majority of American soldiers. And so, like I said, several countries sent troops as well. So in October, UN forces, mostly American, marched across the 38th parallel with the aim of reunifying Korea. Greatly alarmed, the Chinese will send thousands of troops into North Korea and push UN forces back across the 30th parallel. It was a very big stalemate. You know, you have North Korea invades, catches the South Koreans on what do you call it? Not paying attention, right? And so they were pushed all the way down to this area called the Pusan Perimeter. And from there, that's when South Korean troops get support from the UN troops and Americans. And then Douglas MacArthur, remember that guy? Douglas MacArthur leads like a sneak attack to is it the port of Incheon? And does a sneak attack behind enemy lines, catches the North Koreans off guard, and the Americans push, and they push the North Koreans out of South Korea, back across the 38th parallel, even back further into North Korea. And is at the instance of when the troops cross the Yalu River, which is like the border between North Korea and China. Mao says, we're going to help out our communist brothers. And it's because of that, that's where, you know, with the support of the Chinese soldiers and some Soviet advisors. Remember, they didn't fight directly. Soviet advisors, they were able to push back UN forces across the 38th parallel. So it's a big old fat stalemate. Here you have the two leaders during this time period. You have Kim Il Sung, the Kim dynasty, which, as you know, Kim Jong Un, it is his grandfather. This is Kim Jong Un's grandfather, Kim Il Sung, and then North Korean communist dictator. And in South Korea, you had a guy named Syngman Rhee, who was not necessarily democratically elected, but he ruled like a dictator. So he wasn't communist, so that's why we supported him. This is where, before the war, it was split. And then this is the Pusan perimeter. Okay. And they invaded. And then MacArthur leads a sneak attack at the port of Incheon. And they cross over and they push and they push and they push. And here's the Yalu River. And that's when they cross. So then the Chinese come down and push back. So 3 more years of fighting led to no final victory. An armistice was signed in 1953. The 38th parallel remained and still remains today as the boundary line between North Korea and South Korea. The division of Korea was reaffirmed, and to many Americans, the policy of containing communism succeeded in Asia, just as it earlier did in Europe. And I guess you could say it succeeded because it didn't allow it to spread to South Korea. But I will say that the treaty, there is no treaty. So technically, the armistice is just an agreement to stop fighting, right? So there has never been a formal treaty signed to this day. 1953, we are in 2024. All right. So no peace agreement has been signed. So the Korean War also confirmed American fears of communist expansion. The U.S. was now more determined than ever to contain Soviet power. In the mid-1950s, the administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower adopted the policy of massive retaliation. Any Soviet advance, even a ground attack in Europe, would be met with full use of American nuclear bombs. Bombs. It was after the Korean War that American military alliances were extended around the world. As President Eisenhower explained, the freedom which we cherish and defend in Europe and in the Americas is no different from the freedom that is imperiled in Asia. That's his excuse of expanding our power outside our borders. So again, red, just to remind you, boom, 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 Pusan perimeter, sneak attack, push them back, cross the Yalu River, and then the Chinese intervention, 1950, Chinese advance is in gold, 1951, and then they push them back one by one, one by one, one by one, and this is the armistice line. Remember, so this is the 38th parallel, right? That's what originally divided North and South Korea before the war. And then this line is the armistice, the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Here's some Korean photos, Korean War photos. North Korea, South Korea. All right, oink, oink. So after the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower for 8 years, you have the administration of John F. Kennedy. The Cold War confrontations between the United States and the Soviet Union reached frightening levels. In 1959, a left-wing revolutionary named Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista and set up a Soviet-supported totalitarian regime in Cuba. Having a socialist regime with communist contacts so close to the mainland was considered to be a threat to the security of the United States. President Kennedy feared that if he moved openly against Castro, then the Soviets might retaliate by moving against Berlin, and as a result, the stage might be set for 2 superpowers to engage in a nuclear war. All these assumptions, right? For months, Kennedy considered alternatives, and he finally approved the plan of the CIA had proposed. So, to overthrow Fidel Castro, the U.S. trained by the U.S., exiled Cuban fighters to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, and the purpose of the invasion was to cause a revolt against Castro. it is known that once Castro took over, that you know he was pretty totalitarian, like a dictator, ruled with a fist, right? So this invasion began April 16th, 1961, and it was a disaster because by Wednesday, the exiled fighters began surrendering. 114 died, and the rest were captured by Castro. They didn't really catch them off guard, but one of the major importances from this invasion of why it's such a failure was due to, I mean, if you don't know, Cuba is like 90 miles south of Florida, so very close, right? It's like here to Fresno, maybe here to Bakersfield, something like that. Anywho, um, it was just an amphibious lane, but there was supposed to be air support. But the only it's not like Cuba had an air force, right? So the only air support that could be assumed was from the United States. And if the United States was caught giving air support to the Cuban exiled fighters to overthrow Castro, possibly could have been even worse of an outcome than what happened. And so Kennedy withdrew the air support, and that is why it was a failure. They might have caught him off guard, but once Castro and his forces reassembled, it was over. It was over before it even started. So there's JFK. Fidel Castro, he led a revolution, right? So what was it? I think it was in 1952, 1955. Did I say it when he took over? 1959. 1959. There you go. 1959. Also, who helped him take over his island of Cuba was Che Guevara. He is from Argentina, but he also helped Castro and his brother. That's Fulgencio Batista. That's Nikita Khrushchev greeting the Castro brothers. That's the main one we're talking about, Fidel. And there you go, Fidel. Communist, Soviet Union, Communist Cuba. Kind of remind you of someone? Mussolini and Hitler. CIA, and this is Kennedy with the Cuban exiled fighters. There's the Bay of Pigs, right? And this is where they'd land from, but it didn't happen. This is how it was supposed to happen. It didn't happen. And then you have a cigar of Cuban cigar blowing up in Kennedy's face. There are the Cuban revolutionaries. There are the captured prisoners. And wow. So that is only going to increase tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Because it was pretty much assumed that, the US helped. So after the Bay of Pigs, the USSR sent advisors to Cuba in 1962. Khrushchev began to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, which were meant to counteract US nuclear weapons placed in Turkey. It wasn't known until after, but that is why nuclear weapons were placed in Cuba, because the United States, already had nuclear weapons in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. Khrushchev said, "Your rockets are stationed in Turkey. You are worried over Cuba because it lies a distance of 90 miles across the sea and shores of the United States. However, Turkey lies next to us." The United States was not willing to allow nuclear weapons within such close striking distance of its mainland. On October 1962, Kennedy found out that Soviet ships were carrying missiles heading to Cuba. He decided to then blockade Cuba and prevent the fleet from reaching its destination. If you've seen X-Men Origins, there's that scene. This approach gave each side time to find a peaceful situation. So it's like for 13 days, right? This Cuban Missile Crisis. Highest tension in world affairs to this day. Khrushchev agreed to turn back the fleet and remove Soviet missiles from Cuba if Kennedy pledged in return not to invade the island. The Cuban Missile Crisis seemed to bring the world frighteningly close to nuclear war, and indeed, in 1992, a high-ranking Soviet officer revealed that short-range rockets armed with nuclear devices would have been used against U.S. troops had the U.S. invaded Cuba. An option, fortunately, Kennedy rejected. The realization that the world might have been destroyed in a few days also had a profound influence on both sides. A hotline of communication between Moscow and DC was installed in 1963, and the two superpowers could now communicate quickly in times of crisis and be like, hey, is that you invading, Guatemala? No, it's not me, dog. It's the CIA. Something like that, lift the embargo, lift the embargo. You have America surrounding, hey, there's that X-Men clip. And these are spy planes that found, missile shipments, missile like containers from the Soviet Union. And these are all very well documented. So people don't forget. So this is where these were the sites. So that's kind of scary. All those armed and pointed to us. This is like the nuclear effect of if it reached the bomb's capabilities, if it reached to the United States. There's Kennedy and Khrushchev, and they're sitting on bombs, about to press the button. But as you can tell, this is American propaganda because Kennedy looks strong, and you have Khrushchev sweating. There's a movie. All right, split Vietnam. So by 1963, the United States had been drawn into a new struggle that had an important impact on the Cold War, the war in Vietnam. After World War II, most states in Southeast Asia gained independence from the colonial rulers. For example, the Philippines became independent from the U.S. in 1946. Great Britain ended its colonial rule in Southeast Asia. But France refused to let go of its holdings in Indochina, aka Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And this will lead to a long war in Vietnam. Opportunities arose for nationalist leaders in some of these newly independent countries, or in some countries in the middle of conflicts with their neighbors or in civil wars, to improve their positions by aligning with either the U.S. or Soviet Union. Interventions by these superpowers often complicated internal developments, and leaders of these states were often compelled to follow development plans for their countries that likely benefited each other, the U.S. or the USSR, before it benefited their home countries. So leading the struggle against the French colonial rule in Vietnam was the local Communist Party, headed by Ho Chi Minh. In 1945, the Viet Minh, an alliance of Vietnamese rebels under communist leadership, seized power throughout most of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was elected president of the new republic in Hanoi, a large city in northern Vietnam. Refusing to accept this government, France quickly re-seized the southern part of the country. Just like Korea before, Vietnam had been divided into northern and southern halves. So this is Indochina. Here are the French in Vietnam. It is the first Indochina War. That's what it's called. There you go, if you can read. All right, so how it started. So for years, France fought Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh in the control of Vietnam, but without success. In 1954, after a huge defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, France agreed to sign the Geneva Accords. Because of the Korean War, China and the Soviet Union wanted to avoid another conflict with the United States, but consequently, they pressured North Vietnam to agree a temporary partition of the country. Vietnam was divided into two parts. In the North, communist, capital of Hanoi. In the South, non-communists were based in the capital of the city of Saigon. Both North and South agreed to hold elections in 2 years to create a single government. As the conflict continued, Vietnam soon became a part of the Cold War. The United States, opposing the spread of communism, aided South Vietnam under nationalist leader Ngo Dinh Diem. And despite this aid, the Viet Cong, South Vietnamese communist guerrillas supported by North Vietnam, were on the verge of seizing the entire country by early 1965. Their forces also received aid from China. So it's like we're battling an uphill battle. This is Ho Chi Minh on the left. This is the Viet Minh on the right. Again, I think that's the same picture from before, just a little more zoomed in. And some war in Vietnam photos. State of Vietnam, Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Geneva Accords. That's No Din Diem. And here you got America. That's our president, Lyndon B. Johnson. Mightiest nation in history. We've got our nuclear weapons. And then here you have guerrilla warfare, conventional arms, and the Vietnamese hiding in the trees and beating us. This is the Viet Cong. Pictures of the Viet Cong. More pictures. All right, dominoes. So in March 1965, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson sent troops to South Vietnam to keep the communist regime, North Vietnam, and for the control of South Vietnam. U.S. policymakers saw the conflict in terms of a domino theory concerning the spread of communism. Domino theory, test question, gotta know it, gotta know it. Containing, it's like containment, it's a further form of containment. So, if communists succeeded in South Vietnam, the argument went, all other countries in Asia that were freeing themselves from colonial destination would likewise fall like dominoes to communism. Have you guys ever done that with dominoes? And it goes, they all fall down. Well, if one fell, they would all fall. That was the theory. North Vietnam responded to increased presence of American troops by sending more forces south. Despite the massive superiority in equipment and firepower of the American forces, the U.S. failed to defeat the North Vietnamese. In addition, a growing number of American troops in Vietnam soon produced an anti-war movement in the U.S., especially among college students of the draft age. The mounting destruction of the conflict seen on television also turned the public to the war against the war. So this is like the first time in American history that war was televised, and people would turn on their television and watch recaps of battles and seeing gunfire being shot at our troops, and it's just like, wow, we're watching people die on live television. Kind of a surreal idea. Here you have Lyndon B. Johnson, vice president to Kennedy. This is after Kennedy's assassination. Spoiler alert. That's his wife, Jackie Kennedy. Not his wife, Kennedy's wife. So here you have Vietnam, America holding the dominoes, and you got Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh. Photos. Photos. Color photos. This was also the appearance of helicopters. They made their like super debut in war, and they were used primarily in Vietnam. Again, more color photos. A lot of photos, man. A lot of photos. The jungles. So that's the map. You can pause it if you want to look at the areas of where the fighting was. How it went. So President Johnson, condemned for his handling of the costly and indecisive war, decided not to run for re-election. Former Vice President Richard M. Nixon won the election with his pledge to stop the war and bring American people together. Finally, in 1973, President Nixon reached an agreement with North Vietnam and the Paris Peace Accords that allowed the U.S. to withdraw its forces. Then, 2 years after the American withdrawal, communist armies in the North forcibly reunited in Vietnam under communism. Despite the success of the North Vietnamese communists, the domino theory proved to be unfounded. A noisy split between communist China and the Soviet Union put an end to the Western idea that there was a single form of communism directed by Moscow. Under President Nixon, American relations with China were resumed. New nations in Southeast Asia also managed to avoid communist governments. Above all, Vietnam helped show the limitations of American power because it was a failure. And by the end of the war, a new era of American-Soviet relations had begun to emerge. Nixon's the one. Paris Peace Accords. All GIs out of Viet in 60-day ceasefire. There's another Vietnam Vietnam War, 1974. DMZ. Saigon is now Ho Chi Minh City. And then you got the Soviet. I don't know why I can only find it in Italian, but the split of Mao and Khrushchev. Now I wonder if that would have happened if Stalin was still alive. You know, who knows? You never know. Here's Nixon, the first U.S. president to visit communist China. And that is it. Hold up. I need to get the book. Hold up. Wait a minute. So yeah, that's going to conclude our lecture. I know it was a long one. Sorry. Like I said before, it's always been these Cold War conflicts have always been separate sections, and so with it being all combined into one, Cuba, Korea, and Vietnam, it was just a lot. It was just a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. If, like I said, the Cold War is one of my more favorite topics of world history, so maybe that's why you get a little more red in the notes. However, your homework is to do page 503, 2 through 4. Page 503, 2 through 4. So that's going to conclude our time here. Hopefully, you guys did enjoy that. Like I said, sorry for it being too long, but you know, needs must, needs must. Anyways, hopefully, you guys did enjoy that. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.